QSO Today, episode 269, Dennis Kidder, W6DQ. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, my friend Hans Summers, G0UPL's radio kit company, and makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Dennis Kidder, W6DQ, is an amateur radio renaissance man, a collector of game-changing radios pre-World War II to the present. He enjoys 80-meter AM on his Collins broadcast transmitter and working 10 GHz single sideband with the San Bernardino Microwave Society, in addition to being a published author and speaker. W6DQ joins me in this QSO Today. W6DQ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Dennis?
Yeah, Eric, 4Z1UG. This is W6DQ, Eric. Nice to hook up with you.
It's wonderful. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start the beginning of your ham radio story? And before we do that, can you tell me where are you located?
I'm located in the town of Inyokern, which is a small town in the Mojave Desert in California. And we're in an area called Indian Wells Valley. And, of course, if you've watched the news recently, you know that we were home to a series of very large earthquakes within the last 2 months, a 6.4 followed by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake. And we're about 10 miles from that epicenter. So
the valley follows a rift up, I think, probably, up the east side of the Sierra Nevadas?
Eastern Sierra, yeah. It runs up the Eastern Sierras, up through Owens Valley and north, yes.
So you're rocking and rolling.
Yes, indeed. What we call shake and bake out here in the desert.
Right, exactly. So, Dennis, let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. How did it start for you?
Well, it turns out it was another earthquake. It would have been it was 1964, and it was the Alaska earthquake. And my next door neighbor happened to be a ham. And, I was familiar. I saw, you see the antennas. And, of course, the ham shack was off limit to us kids. And his daughter was a friend of mine. We went to school together. And, I'd seen the radios and walked through the ham shack, but off limits, no touch. Well, Alaska earthquake, March 27th, 1964, Good Friday. Bob Martin, W6QJU, saw my dad and I out in the yard and invited us over. He was handling some emergency traffic out of Anchorage. And he took us into the ham shack and spent some time with us explaining what was going on. So I got to sit and listen to the traffic coming out of Anchorage. And so we actually knew about all this stuff before it was showing up on the news back in those days. I mean, it didn't show up on the news until the next day. So it was interesting seeing that firsthand. And that really is what sparked my interest in it, seeing that and going, this is some pretty cool stuff. So,
and what was the hometown?
That was Rolling Hills Estates here in Southern California, near Los Angeles.
So Bob interested you. That was kind of the catalyst that got going. But there was some time before you actually got your license. What happened there?
Well, that was the unfortunate thing. Bob got me started. He encouraged me to get my novice license, and we got some material. He got me some materials to read and learn, and started learning the code, Morse code. Bob got a new job and moved away, and that was the end of that. And you think about, here's a 11 or 12-year-old kid in the early 60s. There's no internet, right? So how do you find out about stuff? How do you find out about other hams, other radio clubs? Where did I go? I spent my time in the library reading, but that didn't really help me. So it wasn't until I got into high school that things really took off, and I met some people that helped me get my license.
Do you remember who they were?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. So I met a fellow in high school. So this is like, 4 or 5 years later. I meet a friend of mine who became a good friend of mine. He was a member of the radio club at that high school. And he was Sid. His name was Sid Faulkner. And in those days, he was WN6MRM. And that was in 1968. So it would have been 4 years later. Sid got me excited about ham radio again, because now here I am exposed to it. Go to the ham radio club meetings, and Sid introduced me to his father, Harrison, W6PM. And Harrison encouraged me and ended up giving me my novice test. And in December of 1969, I got my license. It came in the mail. I passed the test and I got my ticket. Came in the mail right before Christmas, and I was one very excited kid.
And what was the call sign?
It was WN6NIA. Whiskey November 6, November India Alpha. That was my first call.
And how old were you?
What was I, about 17, I guess, probably 17 years old. So that big span from an 11-year-old to 17 before I got my license.
I think in those days you had to upgrade within a year, right?
Within 2 years, actually, in those days. But I think I waited about 4 months. There was a group of us in high school, Sid being one of them. He wanted to upgrade from his novice. And none of us had our driver's license yet. We weren't driving. So my mom drove us down to downtown LA to the Federal Building, which is where the FCC field office was. And Sid, myself, and another fellow, I was trying to think of his call sign. I can't remember his call sign, Glenn. We went and took our exams, and Sid and Glenn passed the general, and I walked out with an advanced, and I was one happy kid again.
And what was the first rig?
Oh, my first rig. Oh, my gosh. So when I met Sid and went to the radio club, they had an auction. And one of the things I loved, I'd been playing with electronics for a number of years and was really into surplus military electronics. So here's an ARC-V set sitting there. There's a BC-696 and a BC-454 receiver. And the transmitter was $6 and the receiver was $5. And so I pulled the money out. Those went home with me. Now I needed a power supply for it. And Bob, when he had moved, there was probably, like most of us, we collect a bunch of junk. There was a bunch of stuff he didn't want to take with him. So it ended up in my garage, my parents' garage. Well, there was enough equipment, enough parts, enough bits and pieces there that I was able to put together a power supply for that set. And I had my first rig. When my license came, it was already up and running, on the air, ready to go. And so I had the ARC-Vs on 80 meters. And my dad helped me put up an antenna that was basically an 80-meter dipole that laid on the roof of our house. And that was my first setup. And I can even tell you my first QSO. Oh,
yeah, I'd love to hear.
Was WN6GLR. He was a highway patrol officer in Oroville, California. Milton McClung. I'll never forget that. That's ingrained.
Oh, that's very amazing.
It's pretty cool.
Now, it seems to me that when you took this equipment home and you kind of whipped together a power supply, you must have had an electronics test bench already?
Well, sort of. Not really. A couple of rudimentary pieces of equipment. You typically got a voltmeter, a soldering iron, and some hand tools, and that was about it.
But you had them already.
I already had that stuff. Yeah, the tools. Yeah, because I'd been playing with this stuff for a long time. Bob sparked the interest in electronics. When Bob QJU.
Right.
Even though I didn't get my ham license, the interest in electronics was there at that point, and I stuck with that. So that never diminished.
Were you building Heath kits or things like that in those days?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, one of the joys of my high school, we started a new high school, brand new school. And our electronics shop there, the instructor had basically gone out and purchased a bunch of Heath kits for our test equipment for the electronics shop. And a couple of us who were, we were kind of labbies, right? We were lab assistants for the shops. There were three of us that we took all this stuff home and built it overnight, and brought it back. And that was fun. So I was building power supplies and VTVMs, and we built a couple of oscilloscopes and signal generators, from Heath kit, which was just a delightful thing to do. I really miss those guys.
Yeah, I do too. I actually have their VTVM on my bench here.
Oh, I've got a whole bunch of their test equipment still. Yes, indeed.
Right, it lasts forever. What is that now? 50 years?
Oh, yeah, it's like 50 years. That's right. Yeah, it's coming up on. That was before I was licensed, so it's actually probably over 50 years now. That would have been like 1968 time frame, 1969. Yeah,
pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was fun.
So let me understand. You get your upgrade to advanced. How did the ham shack change at that point?
Well, there was one other thing that I didn't mention. When I got my license, my folks gave me a Christmas present that year. I'd been using the receiver, that BC454, and I'd been done a lot of listening. Right, I was listening around the bands, listening on 80 meters, listening around the band, listening to learning Morse code, working on my code speed and all of that. And that wasn't the greatest receiver. It was a good receiver, but it wasn't great. Now, one thing that Bob had a profound effect on me was his station was a Collins S line. Oddly enough, Harrison, W6PM, who gave me my novice test, had a KWM2. So did a couple of other Elmers. Everybody had Collins gear back then. So my parents let me get a receiver for Christmas that year, and we went down to the old Henry radio store in West LA, and I got to pick out the receiver I wanted. And there was a 75S3 sitting there. It wasn't super expensive, not like a brand new one. It was a used one, and that came home with us. And that was, as a novice, first on the air, using a 75S3 receiver, and that was a blast. That just changed everything. It was a game changer for me. And the 75S3, I still have it to this day. It's actually sitting on the bench right now. I think the picture I sent you is a picture. That receiver's in that picture. So that I've had that since December of 1969.
Now, you mentioned the KWM2. Did you end up getting one of those as well? I
actually have today 2 of them. That's one of my big passions, is collecting Collins, and I have a KWM2 and a KWM2A, and along with numerous other pieces. But yeah, the KWM2 is a unique radio, and I love the S line. It's wonderful. I prefer using the S line, but the KWM2 is also a very, very nice radio, and there's a lot of history on that radio, doing de-expeditions and what have you. But I had a number of Elmers that really led the way for me to my path in ham radio and getting started, and each one of them contributed something. But it was interesting to me that they all owned Collins equipment, and that did make an impact on me. And of course, when Bob first introduced us, he says, when you get your license, he hands me a Collins catalog and says, this is the equipment that you want to buy. This is the best. And I still believe that to this day.
Do you want to mention those other Elmers?
Oh, absolutely. I can share those. In fact, one of them is very important to me. So Bob was the first, W6QG, and then Harrison, W6PM. Harrison had a couple of friends that he introduced me to. One was a fellow by the name of Bill Dickman. He was W6DR, and his big passion was teletype. That was the thing that he was really into. And he was also a big home brewer, which was another influence on me. The other fellow was a chap by the name of Czech Titcomb. Czech was W6DQ. That's the connection there. Very important that I honor him as one of my Elmers by having the grant of his call sign. So he taught me all about antennas and feed lines and doing all that sort of thing. So I got a lot from him too. And one of the things that, and I'll tell you, it's come full circle. One of the things that always impressed me about his station was he was a big operator on 75 and 80 meters. And he had a phased array of high towers in his front yard. And in those days, your neighbors didn't care. They didn't care about towers in the air. Bob had a 90-foot tower in his backyard with a 5-element 20-meter Yagi on it, and nobody cared. Everybody thought it was great. It's a landmark, right? Look, we live over there by that tower.
It was easy to find your house.
Exactly, and people didn't care about that stuff. They thought it was great to have that. Well, Czech had these high towers in his front yard. Well, what's in my yard now are 4 high towers in a 4-square on 75 and 80 meters. And that was a direct influence of Czech to go that route and do that.
Now, the reason that your father laid the 80-meter dipole on the roof was you were living in Rolling Hills Estates. Did that have a CCNRs?
No, there were no CCNRs. So we lived in a house. It was a ranch-style house, single story, that was about 150 feet long. It was just long and narrow. And I didn't know any better. I'm just a kid just getting started. We put a couple of poles at each end of the house on where the roof extended, and we strung a dipole between those two poles. So it was at each end, it was off the roof, but in the center, the center insulator was actually sitting on the roof. And surprisingly, that worked very well.
Right. And hopefully the roof wasn't a shake roof, right?
Actually, it was, but I was running, running 75 watts the most, and so it really wasn't a big deal. Yeah. So it worked quite well, but it was replaced. I replaced that very quickly with my dad and I put up a 50-foot TV mast in the backyard and put up an inverted V for 80 and 40 at that point. So that's how I got a little bit better antenna setup, and that worked very well as well. One of the things I have to say is that probably one of the greatest influences, these guys are hams that influenced me and were my mentors and Elmer's. My parents played a great role in that because they encouraged me to pursue the things that interested me. So, you talk about ham radio and electronics. They encouraged me to explore that. And that went into, my mother did a lot of work with our school district. So she knew all the teachers and the principals and the educators in our school district. And she was friends with the principal at one of my schools. And the same thing, he was one of the people that encouraged me, but I think that was due to my parents. And secretly, I still believe that Bob Martin and my dad conspired to get me into this stuff.
Well, that's very possible.
It's possible. I have no way of knowing, but I just the way things, the way they worked out, it seems like that's something that he did. He would have had no interest. He wasn't interested in electronics and this technology, but he encouraged me to do it. And so I owe a lot to them for that. It was an important thing.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Absolutely. No question. I was in high school trying to decide career path. Well, it looked like I wanted to do something with electronics. I mean, that was my passion. And so I ended up in engineering school and studied electrical engineering, got my BSEE, and it was a direct influence. If I didn't have the ham license, if I've never been interested in that stuff, I probably never would have gone into engineering. I probably would have taken another there were some other things that interested me. Architecture was one of the things I was interested in, and astronomy I was interested in. So, and in particular, radio astronomy interested me, and so that would have been my other paths that I could have looked at. But electronics engineering and electrical engineering, that was the way I went, and it has served me well over the years. I've had a great career in a number of different fields of electronics. So,
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. It's time to get the transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products for the occasional operator, rag chewer, DXer, or contester. Make the most out of contest season with one of these ICOM transceivers today. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance transceiver has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, or SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. The ICOM IC7610 features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The ICOM IC7300 changes the way that entry-level HF transceivers are designed. This high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design will far exceed your expectations. I purchased the IC7300 last fall and have fallen in love with its waterfall display, allowing me to zero in on activity and potential QSOs on the air. The ICOM IC7300 features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope with waterfall display, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7851 is the primo contester's HF transceiver. Keep your competitive contesting edge with faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. The ICOM's IC7851 is the pinnacle of HF perfection. The ICOM IC7851's features include dual receivers to allow you to listen and to pounce on contest contacts, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. So be ready for the upcoming contests this season with a new ICOM transceiver. ICOM has rigs for every level of operator, and they are available at the ham radio store near you. Go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine ICOM transceivers. And when you make that ICOM purchase, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, I saw that you went to Northrop University for your BSCE.
Yes.
And as I recall, Northrop University was like in Torrance. It was in Southern California. It was kind of in the center of all of the aerospace industry.
Absolutely. It was in the city of Inglewood, right by the airport. And the interesting history of that school, it started out as, during World War II, Northrop Aviation, they were finding a shortage of aeronautical engineers. And so they started a school to train aeronautical engineers. After the war, the school became independent. It purchased itself away from Northrop Aviation, Northrop Corporation, and became an independent private engineering school. And unfortunately, today they're gone. But in those days, it was called the Northrop Institute of Technology. And about the time I graduated, they became an accredited university with a bunch of other programs. Like they had a law program, and they had, of course, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, aeronautical engineering. It was an interesting place. That the professors, and this was another thing that was a great influence, is the professors, the educators there were from industry. Their day job was working over at Northrop, or working over at TRW, or working over at Hughes Aircraft. And they'd come over and teach classes at Northrop. So you had a direct connection into the industry, which I thought was wonderful. And it was an incredible place to go to school. Real hands-on engineering training. So It, like you were asking, it had absolute direct influence on the paths I chose. That was my first experience with microwave, was in engineering school, and as a result of that, I ended up teaching the microwave lab. Became a lab instructor and learned a lot more about microwave technology. And funny thing is, I will share that all the studies in microwave in college, all my years with ham radio, after 45 years or so in the industry, it wasn't until the last few years that I was working before I retired that I actually got to play with radios.
Interesting. It
was interesting. Yeah, it really off in all kinds of other things, but primarily computer systems, large-scale computer systems. But it was funny. I had to chuckle about that. One of our programs I worked on, the chief scientist of the program came to me one day. They were trying to figure out how to build an antenna for this radio system we had. They said, "Dennis, you're a ham. You know about antennas. What do you think we should do for this?" And I got a big kick out of that. That's like the first time anybody ever asked me to do something about radio in my career.
Now, did you spend most of your career in Southern California?
I worked for companies in Southern California most of the time. I did spend a lot of time overseas. I worked for a couple of small companies when I got out of college in a different industry, in sound, doing sound engineering. That's how I got started in computers, was through that. We got into audio animatronics, and we started doing audio animatronics using computers. Small company. But I left that to go to another company. Well, I had my own business for a while in there doing sound engineering as well, but left that industry and went into computer industry and started working with PDP-11s, which I still love to this day. They're a fantastic computer to work with.
Do you have your PDP-11 front panel with a Raspberry Pi running all the lights and the switches?
Oh boy, I would love to. I dream of that. I did have a PDP-11 for a long time. And I met a fellow who was a computer collector, and he had some vintage radio pieces that were very interesting to me. And we did a swap. He got my PDP-1105, and I got his parts that came from one of Marconi's transmitting sites. So that was a special deal. So I was happy to give up the PDP-11 for that. But I did a lot of foreign travel. I spent time in Australia, lived in Australia for a while working with Hughes Aircraft, and ended up in Hong Kong working on the airport over the new airport, international airport in Hong Kong. I was the chief telecom engineer during that program. So I spent 4.5 years in Hong Kong and then came back to the States, and I ended up in Switzerland off and on for a couple of years working on a program over there. So all that time, of course, I maintained a residence in Southern California. When I went to Hong Kong, I had to give up my residence. Now that I think about it, I did give up my residence. And so I had a 4-year stint or so where I didn't live at all in Southern California, but that's about the only time.
Can we go back to audio animatronics for a second? I mean, as a kid, that's all I wanted to do was work for WED Industries, which was that Walter Elias Disney factory where they made all of the audio animatronics. What were you building? Were you building for them, or were you building for like the pizza stores?
No, we weren't working for Disney. And they actually tried to hire me at one point. I interviewed with them, with WED Industries. And instead ended up at another company, Logicon, which was, my opinion, was a good choice because it was close to home. But we were doing some interesting stuff. Some other amusement parks like Six Flags. We were doing animatronics for Six Flags, their parks. And typically they'd be small figures that would be around the park, not something large scale. Knott's Berry Farm. That was probably the big one. We did Knott's Berry Tales here at Knott's Berry Farm out here in Orange County. And we did all the animation and all the sound systems for that. It was a dark ride. And that was a lot of fun. And let's see, I think the most interesting project we worked on was for Universal Studios, was they did they had a theme area from the movie Jaws, which included this big shark that would come up out of the lagoon and attack the buses, right? We did the system that ran that. That was actually, there's a funny story about that we had built a more advanced animatronic system using the computers that you could go back and do inserts and change the program after the fact, which was real difficult in the early days because it was all done with audio tracks, right? We'd use tone encoding on a tape to control the figures. That was one of the early systems. Using a computer, we could go back and edit the animation, which made it really easy to work on this stuff. So you can do a little bit at a time and piece it all together, kind of what you're doing with your audio. So we're doing Jaws, and this thing looked like an F-16 fighter jet with the skin off of it. So it's just this aluminum frame, this massive aluminum frame with these giant hydraulic rams in it, and we're controlling these hydraulic rams to make the thing that the I don't know what you'd call it, the motor motion of the shark.
Right, the tail going back and forth.
The tail going back and forth, but it was going in a very complex motion with the opposed rams moving. There were like 3 or 4 hinge points in the tail, and they're all moving in concert. So we did all this animation. We spent days and days doing the animation. Then they decided to put the skin on the shark, which was like 2 inches of neoprene, and it wouldn't move. It couldn't move the tail, so we had to go back and reprogram it. But that was pretty interesting. But yeah, that was a neat little project to work on. The shark at Universal Studios here in Hollywood, or Universal City and here in LA. That was pretty neat.
It sounds really great.
That was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm.
Your bio says that you do a lot of things, including collecting and restoring boat anchors or vintage ham radio gear. And if you look at your QRZ page, then you'll see that that's an understatement. It sounds like to me like you've already kind of set up how you got interested in this stuff, but what kind of stuff are you collecting, and what do you do to restore it?
One of the things that I got interested in some years ago was the history of radio. And so I started collecting what I considered the game changers throughout the history of radio and communications. And so I focused on, there were a couple of companies and a couple of individuals that really had a big influence on radio, if you think about it. And somebody like, give me a second. there's this little CRS moment here. I got to think of his name.
Art Collins.
No, well, before Art Collins, I'm thinking of James Millen is the one that comes to mind right off the bat. James Millen, to me, he had a profound effect on the early days of radio. He and Jim Millen, who worked at National Radio Company, right? And he wrote a series of papers in QST called the Single Signal Receiver, and it was all about pulling having a high performance receiver with narrow bandwidth that you could pull a CW signal out of this morass of other signals, because up until that time things were pretty broadband and signals were kind of tough to pull out. Well, Millen became kind of a hero to me, and so I started collecting National. And so I have an interesting set of National equipment that is right now, a lot of it, I got to tell you, a lot of it's in storage, but some of it I think shows up on the QRZ page. Those pictures are very old, by the way. Things have changed quite a bit since then. New QTH, new displays, but I started looking at some of the other things that were going on, and of course, you mentioned Art Collins. Collins has always been I've always been a big fan of Collins in terms of their technology and the effects that they've had on communications. I mean, simple things like a PTO, that changed the way we build VFOs, using a PTO instead of using an inductor with a movable slug rather than a capacitor. And that came about during World War II. And all the receivers they built after that used that technology. So Collins was a big one. National was a big one. So I have one of my radios from National is an HRO that was like the third month of production. So it's a really early one. So that's kind of a special radio. But I go through all of their technology, going all the way back with National to things like the SW2, which was a kit. I have somebody built one of these. I've actually got the radio that somebody else built from an SW2 kit. Then they had the SW3s, which was a little regenerative 3-tube regenerative receiver. I've got several of those in the collection. And then this was the stuff that was being made available to hams at the time that really were higher performance than the other receivers at that period of time in the mid to late 20s. Then the FB7, which was some of their early super heterodyne receivers. Again, a low-cost radio that hams could afford. The one to me that's really exciting out of all of that is something called an AGS. And the AGS was one of the first, I won't say it was the first, it was either the first or second commercial shortwave super heterodyne receiver that National built for the government, for the CAA, right, the Civil Aviation Authority in those days. And it was AGS, air-to-ground service. And these were super het receivers, 3 interchangeable coils that you had to unplug the 3 coils and plug 3 more coils in. And that directly led to the HROs after that. The coils were all joined together in a single box. So you didn't have to change individual coils and get them mixed up, which was a problem. You pulled out the box and stuck in a new box, and you were on a different range of frequencies. So the early HROs followed the AGSs. And it's a beautiful radio. It's really beautifully built. The manufacturing of it is just spectacular for the day. So that stuff really, that really became my passion, was collecting those types of things. And I probably had, before I moved here to the new QTH, I probably had several hundred receivers of various vintages that were prior to World War II. And these are not like table radios, but I'm talking about shortwave and, early radios.
So they were big.
They're large, yeah. They're not like consoles, but they take up a shelf, that's for sure. But all the different progression through the technology, and that just fascinated me. One of the things I used to say is I was born 50 years too late. I would have loved to have been part of that evolution. It would have been an incredible thing to see.
Besides National and Collins, what were the other game changer companies in your opinion?
Gosh, now you got me on the spot there. I got to think about this for a minute. because I haven't thought about that for a long time.
Is it like based on what you've collected? So, for example, do you think the R.L. Drake Company or World Radio Labs?
Yeah, Drake was definitely, well, World Radio Labs was a game changer in a different fashion. That was a cost point, price point with World Radio Labs. They and Swan, these guys produced radios that every man could afford. The Collins and even the Drake was an expensive radio. And so producing a radio that anybody could afford to buy, those were game changers, absolutely. But they weren't game changers in terms of the taking a step in terms of the technology. They were using the existing technology, but making it available to everybody. So that was an important thing. Popularized things like single sideband. Single sideband probably wouldn't have become what it is today if it weren't for companies like you mentioned, World Radio Labs and the Galaxies. The Galaxies were a really low cost radio that was high performance, and the Drakes were great quality but affordable. And I have a bunch of Drakes in my collection. One of the game changers with Drake was when they went to it started with the TR5 and then the TR7. The TR7 is an incredible, if you look at just the R7 receiver, it's an incredible receiver for the period of time that it came out. Uses a high-level front-end mixer. And, a high-level mixer, it's much less susceptible to overload of strong signals. So that was a big step, and that's still a good receiver today. Again, Drake used a PTO, the influence of Collins.
Now, in your remodeling that you're doing out there in Inyokern, are you going to build a large enough space where you can actually put all these receivers and transmitters and transceivers in their places and be able to connect to them and use them?
That is the goal. The new ham shack will have 1,500 square feet. And the goal is to have everything that is operating. Some of those radios are hangar queens. They'll never work. But a lot of them that do work and can work will be out on display and potentially operable in various areas. And there'll be various areas within the shack that are set aside for maybe a particular era of radio or a particular manufacturer or what have you. That's our goal, and we're well on the way to getting there. But like I said, the earthquake, we were about halfway through the project and that big earthquake hit, and it's like everything went to a standstill because my contractor, who was doing a lot of the work, is now rebuilding homes in Ridgecrest, which were damaged by the earthquake. So I'm not going to get him back for a while.
When the whole project is finished, then people could stop at the Kidder Radio Museum on their way up to the Mammoth Lakes to go skiing.
Absolutely. Sure. Absolutely. I would welcome that. That's cool.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, it looks from your QRZ page that you collect some broadcast transmitters. Small AM station transmitters, 5,000 watt transmitters, 1,000 watt?
What they used to call them things like daytimers. These stations had run 1,000 watts during the day and 250 watts at night. There's a large community of folks who have rescued old broadcast transmitters and put them on the ham bands. They're beautifully simple and elegant radios, and it takes a special kind of person to have to put up with one of these things. It takes a lot of space. They're big and heavy. I mean, these things weigh 1,000 pounds, and they take up a lot of floor space. But they're a lot of fun, and a lot of folks poo-poo AM, but it's our roots. You think about it, it is our roots. They're high fidelity, beautiful audio. 100% modulated AM signal is really something wonderful to listen to. And we have a number of nets around the country. One in particular here in Southern California that we belong to is the West Coast AMI. It's AM International, West Coast AMI. And we get on every Wednesday, and a lot of these guys have old broadcast transmitters, and some of them are old broadcast engineers. We've got a couple of guys that one of the fellows does a lot of restoration of AM broadcast transmitters, and they just sound fantastic on the air. And interestingly enough, the only thing that comes close to sounding like an AM broadcast transmitter is I got into Flex Radio, and the Flex 5000 with Power SDR. The AM that comes out of that thing is phenomenal. It is just it sounds like a broadcast transmitter, and it is a neat thing. But like I say, it takes some dedication to have one of these things. And I have 3 broadcast transmitters right now, and I'm about ready to acquire a 4th.
And what do you have?
Okay, so my main transmitter right now is a Collins. It's called a 550A1, and it was a 500 watt broadcast transmitter, AM broadcast, and it came from North Carolina. I don't know all the provenance of the station it belonged to, but it did come out of North Carolina. It was sitting in somebody's garage who was going to put it on he was going to run it as an AM station in the broadcast band. And he was expecting to win an auction for an assignment, lost the auction, transmitter sat. Guys out here found it, brought it out to California, restored it, and it's a thing of beauty. It's a work of art. It's just gorgeous transmitter. And you run it at 375 watts carrier, and that'll allow you to run full legal limit at 100% modulation at 1500 watts out. And it's just beautiful, beautiful audio. So that's my primary transmitter. Then I have a couple of pieces of history that were made by Western Electric. Western Electric built a lot of broadcast equipment back before World War II. And I have 2 Western Electric 451A1 transmitters. This is a 250 watt AM transmitter, very Art Deco, and quite an elegant looking transmitter. Neither one of those is on the air. They're still undergoing restoration. And one will probably end up being possibly a parts source for the second one. But another beautiful broadcast transmitter. That one I do know the provenance of. It came from a station here in Glendale near Los Angeles, KIEV. That was their transmitter, and one of my friends was actually a broadcast engineer at that station and ran that transmitter. So that's how I know where it came from and what its history is. So that's kind of a special piece of equipment. Very, very interesting piece of gear.
Now, what's interesting in researching you, Dennis, is that you'd think you'd like all this old gear, but you're the former president of the San Bernardino Microwave Association, so you're also up in the 10 gigahertz range and higher. So how did that happen?
Well, it's, one of the neat things about ham radio, and this is one of the things that's always interested me in it, is there's something for everybody, and there's just so many different things you can do. I've done a lot of different things in ham radio, and microwave was one of those things that I always wanted to get into. I got interested in that. I said in college I taught a class. In high school I actually built a 10 gigahertz radio, but I didn't have anybody to talk to, so it basically sat on the shelf. But it was a project that was published in QST, and I built one of these things. It was crazy. But it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot doing that. But I ultimately didn't have anybody to talk to. But when I got home from Hong Kong, which was around 1999, I came back to the States. I repatriated, and I met a fellow. I was interested in moon bounce. I wanted to explore that, and so I met a fellow quite by accident at a star party, astronomy star party. We were at this site and could hear a radio, single sideband, and we tracked it down. And here's a car sitting there with the call plates on it. And I go, this is a guy that I heard about to do moon bounce. He does moon bounce. And so I've been wanting to meet him. And I just by chance ran into him at this astronomy thing. And we became very good friends. We've been good friends ever since that day. And he was involved with the Microwave Society and got me involved in it, became a member, and eventually became the president of the society, but built a number of different radios over the years. We used a lot of surplus, repurposing old surplus, particular stuff that came out of Qualcomm. They had Qualcomm was producing a lot of stuff that ended up being scrap, and we could repurpose that to build a 10 gigahertz narrowband single sideband radio. And that to me was very fascinating. And you always think of microwaves, especially like 10 gigahertz, you think of that as being point-to-point line of sight.
Right.
With a 1-watt radio, my best DX to date is just shy of 1,000 kilometers, so about 695 miles, something like that. And that was from, that would have been from Ranger Peak up near Santa Barbara down into Baja California, about almost 700 miles, 695 miles. That just, I was blown away by that, the fact that you could do that sort of thing on the microwaves. There's some really well-known folks involved with SBMS that were really the movers and shakers of microwave communications and ham radio. One of them lives here in Ridgecrest, and that's Chuck Swedblum, W6DQ. He is a longtime fixture with the San Bernardino Microwave Society. And guys like Chip Angle and 6CA was another big gun in the Microwave Society. Chip held a lot of microwave records between here and Hawaii, which is, to me, astonishing. 2,500-mile path all the way up to 5.7 gigahertz. So these are the kinds of things we were doing with the Microwave Society. So that was interesting stuff. And as an aside, Doug, I did eventually get into moon bounce. I had put together a 2-meter EME station and was doing it the old-fashioned way, like I like to say, by ear, doing CW, which was fabulous. But one of the things that got us involved in, and I don't know if you read about this or not, but we got hooked up with the Owens Valley Radio Observatory, which is about 110 miles north of where I live here. And they have a 40-meter dish that was sitting dormant at the time. And they used it for educational outreach. And we got involved with them, with San Bernardino Microwave Society, using the 40-meter dish at OVRO. We got to use that for about 2.5 hours doing EME on 1296 and on 10 gigahertz. And let me tell you what an experience that was. Oh, man.
So there's some advantages of a 40-meter dish over a 12-meter dish, over a 3-meter dish.
Or a 3-meter or a 2-meter dish. Yeah, we call it dish envy. My gosh. I got the stories. We were running single sideband on 1296 off the moon. And one of the stations over in Europe sent me a soundbite of our signal. And it's clear enough that you can tell who's talking. You can tell who the operator is. The voice is that clear. And we've got, the fascinating thing is seeing echoes off the moon that are 20 and 30 dB over S9. When I was doing 2 meters, you're right at the noise level, right?
Right.
These things are so far out of the noise. It's just amazing to listen to that. So that was a lot of fun. That was, like I said, we had access for about 2.5 years, and then we lost access to the dish because another fellow came along with a grant, and we were happy to relinquish it because that meant the guys at the observatory stayed employed. They had money to keep the observatory going, so he's using the 40-meter dish, and that's pretty neat, But we got to use it for quite a while, anytime we wanted to. We had full access to it. We had our own key to the control room, and then we could go in there and use it. So that was pretty neat.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. It seems to me that around California, tucked into the valleys of California Mojave Desert, that there would be quite a number of those kinds of dish opportunities. Goldstone comes to mind, but it seems to me that there must be other places as well. Do those places really exist, and do they have available dishes?
As a matter of fact, it's a good question. You mentioned Goldstone. So Goldstone had a program going, not with amateur radio, but with the school district, I think in San Bernardino, doing radio astronomy. And they had a surplus dish, one of their big dishes, like a 30-meter dish, that they made available to the schools to do radio astronomy. And I think that what ended up happening is nobody took advantage of it, which is, to me, is sad. That's a shame. Really a tragedy that they didn't use that. The other one that comes to mind is there was an abandoned, I want to say it was ComSat. I'm trying to think of who it belonged to. I want to say it was ComSat, and it was a 30-meter dish in the community of Jamesburg up in Northern California, right out, like near Monterey, Carmel area, tucked up into a valley there somewhere. And the guys up in the Bay Area, the microwave guys, 50 meg and up group, which is the sister group of, there's actually 3 groups here in Southern California: San Bernardino Microwave Society, the San Diego Microwave Group, and the 50 megahertz and up group in the Bay Area. The group up there in the Bay Area got access to that dish from the owner, and they had it operating for a while, but they lost access to it. Something happened that they had a falling out, I believe, with the owner, or the thing was suddenly just unavailable to them anymore, and they weren't able to use it. But they were doing the same kind of thing that we were doing, but nowhere near the length of time or the success that we had with our setup. One of the things that we were doing was bringing school children up to Owens Valley, to the observatory, and exposing them to radio astronomy and the science of astronomy and all of that. So that's what the observatory loved about us being there, was it just keyed right into their outreach program. That's what makes this sort of thing successful, is if you have access to something like that and have a way to tie that into the community somehow. And in this case, it was essentially getting free advertisement for Caltech and OVRO. They just jumped on that. I do have to tell you a funny story that we were up there for a conference that was the Society of Amateur Radio Astronomers, SARA, and we had been invited to that conference. And that's when we learned about the dish being in disuse. And the fellow that was giving us the tour said, hey, come up, write a proposal and send it to the director and see what happens. And we're all looking at each other and going, let's do some moon bounce. So we actually wrote a proposal, and we kind of patterned it after the ARIS program, right? The amateur radio and the space station, as an educational thing. And then we sent this letter off, and it was like an email, right? And within hours, we get a phone call from the director of the observatory that says, we really like your proposal. When can you start? Can you come up this weekend? And we just got the biggest kick out of that. And it's like, yeah, well, we'll come up. We have to come up and we've got to, survey and look at the cabling, see how we're going to fit into the telescope, and how this is all going to work, because it's kind of a unique interface, very different from what we're used to working with. But we had a lot of fun with the fellows up there, made some really good friends, and we still have access to the observatory, and we're still up there doing programs all the time with the Owens Valley Radio Observatory, with one of their astronomers up there. Interestingly enough, I just learned that the director of the observatory at that time, who invited us up and allowed us access to their instrument, is now the director of the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, or National Radio, NRAO, and National Radio Astronomical Observatory, which is the one out at Green Bank. That's his baby. So I was impressed. That's really cool that he was the fellow that got us started up there. So kind of an exciting few years that we had playing with that. And, one of the funny things that ended up happening was we got on for one of the EME, the ARRL, they called it the ARRL International EME contest. We did single band 1296 multi-op, and we absolutely destroyed the record score, which was something like in the 20,000 range, and our score was like up in 120 or 150,000 points, which was unheard of. And because we were using an institutional antenna, we're not supposed to get a certificate, but we got one anyway. So we got a certificate from the ARRL as having this incredible high score on 1296 with a single band multi-op EME contest, and it was quite an experience, and kind of like what I'd call a once in a lifetime experience that lasted 2.5 years. Would be the way I describe it.
You're the co-author of Arduino Projects for Amateur Radio with Jack Purdom, W8TE. It's available everywhere, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes page. What's your favorite project in that book, and how did you and Jack come to write that book?
First, writing the book, Maker Faire. We do a lot of work at the Maker Fairs, and we look at the Maker Faire as a perfect opportunity to influence people, especially young people, to get into amateur radio as well as engineering and technology. We do a program at Maker Faire, the main Maker Faire in San Mateo, called Not Your Grandpa's Ham Radio, and we exhibit some of the not so common technology involved with ham radio. So we have a lot of fun with that. I was asked to do a talk about our projects at Maker Faire. They have a forum, and I was asked to be a speaker at the forum. And I did a talk on what our exhibits were, and I was approached after the talk by a woman who introduced herself as she was a publisher. And she had a client who was looking for a co-author for a book on Arduino. And he was a software guy, and he was looking for a hardware guy. And that's Jack. Jack's background, he's got an amazing background in software engineering and programming. He's a retired professor from Purdue University, and he doesn't have the hardware background. So we got hooked up by her and ended up not going with her publishing company, but we ended up with McGraw-Hill, which was, to me, was astounding that McGraw-Hill wanted us to come and do our book there. But that's how we got started. And believe it or not, that entire book was written. Jack and I have never met face-to-face. We've communicated maybe half a dozen times on the phone. Everything else was done over email and using Dropbox to exchange ideas and information. So we had some ideas for some projects, and that's one of the things we submitted in our proposal. We gave a list. These are the projects we'd like to do, and submitted the proposal to McGraw-Hill, and they just jumped on it. And what Jack had asked me to do is, before we ever submitted our proposal to them, we'd written like 2 or 3 chapters and built a couple of the projects. So we actually had material to give them. Said, this is the style, this is what we're proposing to do. And the rest is history. I mean, to me, it was just an incredible undertaking. And again, a lot of fun and something that I'm quite frankly very proud of. I actually have a title in the Library of Congress, which is a pretty cool thing. Never thought I would do that, but that's how the book came about. And my favorite project, I think my favorite project is the watt meter that I designed. It's basically a directional watt meter, a lot of fabrication. I don't know. I would love to know how many people have duplicated that and built it. I'm right now looking at building another one like it for myself here, and another one to duplicate that design and maybe improve it a little bit. That's probably my favorite project because it really used that one really used all my skills, my engineering skills, to build the directional coupler and to be able to do the math and do the calibrations, and having the equipment on my test bench to actually be able to do that and accomplish it. That was probably, to me, the most interesting project, and the one I really enjoy the most.
What project would you recommend someone picking up the book for the first time, maybe not being as big as maybe as experienced as you and Jack are in this area? What would you recommend as a first project out of the book?
Probably one of the early projects in there. We did a digital panel meter. It's real simple. It's uses an LCD display, and the LCDs are very inexpensive, readily available, and that is it's an actually easy. The parts are readily available to build it, so that's probably a good starter. It actually, there's a progression through the book. You start by building the display itself. That's one of the first projects. I think that is the first project for the book, if I recall, is building the display, and then you have an add-on to that, which is the meter, the voltmeter that gets added to that, and that was kind of fun, and it was kind of neat to see that thing work the first time. And so that's probably a good little project. And then, the progression from that might be, there's a nice little QRP dummy load that Jack built, and you can plug that voltmeter into it and measure power from the dummy load. So those two things kind of integrate together. That's probably in my mind maybe the simplest and easiest starting point. Yeah. Some of the more complicated things, some of the projects get a little bit more complicated in terms of their construction, are things like there's a DDS VFO that actually works very well. It's pretty clean, and we actually talk about that. I've got some spectrum plots of the output of that VFO, and it's pretty nice. But that's a little bit more complicated. But that display board gets used on a couple of other projects. Like there's an antenna controller, rotator controller, that uses that same display board, so it gets reused, and that was kind of a fun project too.
So it sounds like this book has, frankly, a project that will really complement the Ham Shack, not just things you'll use and throw away.
Exactly. That was the goal. And it's really up to the builder as to how you're going to package it. Everything was just left bare. It's just a bare board, and you package it the way you want it. You use the interfaces the way you want them. But it was definitely, the thought in mind was to be able to build projects that would be useful and practical. One of the things, Jack's big in QRP, so the DDS VFO became a way to get away from being rock bound, and actually take some of these little low-cost QRP radios and put a VFO on them. And that was kind of a nice goal to be able to do that, and we had a lot of fun with that. And he's presented that at what they call it's the 4 Days in May,
right?
Presentation at Dayton. Yeah, he's done a lot of presentations there. So we've gotten a lot of mileage out of the projects. In fact, you may know that we did he with another fellow on the East Coast did a project that was featured in QST a few years ago, and the three of us got the.
I'll cite that in the show notes.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, the three of us received a cover plaque for that project, which was pretty cool, because it was based on my original DDS VFO design that they evolved into an upgrade for a QRP radio that they published at QST, which was great. It's a good thing. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
I think the biggest challenge facing ham radio right now is that we have to struggle to get young people involved in it to keep it going. I look at all the old timers we're going away. I mean, we're dying off, and we need new blood to keep ham radio going. And so one of the challenges is doing something that appeals to young people. Young people, they got their cell phones and their video games and all this. What does ham radio have that would appeal to them, like a cell phone or Twitter. How does it, they got a cell phone with Twitter. What good is ham radio? So I think that's a big challenge, is getting folks interested in it. And once you've got them interested in it, keep them interested in it. One of the things that I see is we get a lot of guys licensed, and the big push was, through the league. And I'm not saying anything negative about this. This is a positive thing, is getting folks involved in ham radio because of emergency communications. That's a really important thing. But there's more to ham radio than emergency communications, and emergency communications will not keep ham radio going. It's really going to take an influx of people that have the passion that we had when we were kids to be able to further the hobby. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges to date. There's probably plenty of other ones, but that one, and that's the main reason that we got involved with Maker Faire. We saw that as a great route to expose the public to ham radio. Just the numbers. You go to Dayton and there's 25,000 people there, and they're all hams. So you're not telling them anything they don't know, right? You go to Maker Faire in San Mateo, there's 150,000 visitors that come to that fair. And a lot of those people stop by our booth and visit with us and see the things that we're doing. And just the name alone, Not Your Grandpa's Ham Radio, that says something right there, that we're trying to show people that there's more to ham radio than a bunch of old guys sitting around in their rocking chairs in the basement talking on 75 meter single sideband.
Or AM, for that matter.
Or AM, yeah.
Yeah. Both
of which I do. I love 75 meters and I have a lot of fun there. But we have very select groups that we do that with. But yeah, Maker Faire is a great opportunity to show those things off. So we're showing off things like microwave. We're showing off things, but like broadband hamnet, mesh networks. And these guys come up and they understand that stuff. They're educated and they understand things like mesh network. We're saying, well, look, you can build your own mesh network using these Linksys routers and the Ubiquiti routers and what have you, and they get interested in this stuff. Now, whether they go off and they get their license, I have no idea. We don't have any way to keep statistics on all of that. But the fact that we're exposing people to this in large numbers, and to me, that's the way to do it.
Well, it seems like the challenge with Maker Faire then is being able to somehow follow up on an encounter with someone.
Yes. Yeah, that's difficult to do. However, you get repeat visitors over the years. And one of the groups that's up in the Bay Area does a licensing session at Maker Faire. And I think that's good. But one of the things that I don't think is good is that you have guys that go to Maker Fairs and they set up an HF radio out in the parking lot and make contacts. That's not the way to show off ham radio to that crowd. It's a maker crowd. We're the original makers. That's what we did back in the early days. We built our own radios from scratch. So that's the thing you got to show off.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Oh boy.
You have to choose one thing now, Dennis.
Yeah, I have to choose one thing. Now, let me think about that. I'm go through this thing.
I'm talking to a guy that has 1,500 square feet of buildings about to build for all the things in ham radio.
I think a lot of people will object to this, but I think one of the exciting things, and this kind of dovetails into what I was just talking about getting people interested in it. Of all things, I think one of the exciting things that's happening right now is what's going on with some of the digital modes. Things like FT8. FT8 allows people who are in a challenged environment. Let's say you mentioned homeowner association earlier, CCNRs, minimalist system, being able to make contacts throughout the world directly using FT8 under extremely poor conditions of our sunspot cycle. To me, that's pretty exciting. And I think that's it may have the effect of that may not be good. I mean, it's changing the face of ham radio. But in some ways, it's changing it in a way that I think nobody ever expected, that people are making contacts that they never, ever could have made on sideband or CW or any other mode for that matter. So FT8 is it's a big game changer. And to me, that's kind of exciting to see that happening. you can kind of compare it to the shift from, I look at the opposition to it, right? And I think about the opposition to CW from Spark to sideband from AM. And I think we're going through that same progression now. You have a new generation of hams that the digital modes are the ones that are going to interest them.
Right, and they're more comfortable using the keyboard rather than the microphone.
Exactly. So to me, that's kind of exciting. That's kind of an exciting thing. Where, I missed the AM sideband transition because I hadn't been born yet. But here's a transition that's taking place right now that I'm in the middle of. And to me, that is exciting. That's an interesting thing.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Something that I wish I had done earlier. That's an easy answer. Join an active radio club. Find a local club that has an active membership that's doing things beyond just having meetings. They're out doing things. They're actually operating. They're having building sessions. They're not just sitting around using their 2-meter handy talking on a repeater. Life exists beyond a repeater. Join a club. Get together with other hams who are like-minded, right, that you have a common interest with. Like San Bernardino Microwave Society, if you live here in Southern California, that's a fantastic organization that's really into the technology of communications. You've got things like the Southern California DX Club, Northern California DX Club here in California. I'm just talking my area here, but throughout the country and throughout the world, these groups exist. And to me, that's probably would be the smartest thing that a newcomer could ever do, because they're going to have it's going to open a whole world of new resources to them, of folks with a lot more experience that can help them and elmer them. And it's hard to find that anywhere else. Most new hams, they get their license, they go to a VE session, they get their license and they get a handshake and that's it. They're gone. And what do they do now? The way to get around that obstacle is to join a club.
I also get the sense that there's a lot of almost 800,000 amateur radio licenses granted in North America at this point, that a lot of VEs, without making a big criticism, but that the follow-up is always the hardest part.
Yes.
Making sure that person has a license. Somebody calls them and says, okay, now that you have the license, come to our club.
Exactly. That's what has to happen.
Marketing.
And a lot of, it's marketing. It's marketing ham radio. A lot of VEs don't do that. And that's why I say, if nobody's approaching you, you got your license, you've got your ticket. Take a little incentive, and the easiest thing is go to the ARRL website and look for clubs in your area. At least here in the States, yeah.
I don't think anybody gets the QSL cards from the little print shop anymore, right? When you get your license.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think they may even be. I don't even know if they're still in business or not. I have no idea.
They may not be, but that seemed to be, that was the hallmark. You usually found out what your call sign was before the FCC notified you.
That's true. That's interesting. I'd forgotten all about that, but yeah, you're absolutely right. But, I think about when I got my license, when I actually got my license, I had a cadre of gentlemen who gave everything to help us as kids and get us involved. And they taught us and they showed us how to operate, proper operating procedures on the air. And they made their stations available to us to operate. And so that whole process, I think in a lot of cases, and in majority of cases, that process is gone. Like you say, you go to the VE session and they may give you some information. Well, here's a website you could go to and find some more information. Well, that's not going to cut it. You really need to be hands-on. You need to have people that you can sit and interface with, have an eyeball QSO, interface with one-on-one, and learn your path through ham radio, and they're going to help guide you along the way. And I think that's something that's really missing today. So to me, a new ham, like I said, a new ham, seeking out, if it's not afforded to you by the VE, seek out a local radio club, and there may be several in the area. Attend meetings and get the feel for what those clubs do. And maybe one of those will appeal to you, and join the club, and you're off and running. I think that's important stuff.
Do you think that the perception that the Internet has replaced our source of learning, so that maybe the VEs think that, well, of course, they can just Google this on the Internet and they'll find the club or they'll find their path, when in the days that we became hams, there was no Internet. There was the Encyclopedia Britannica and maybe Henry Radio. But you had these guys in the radio clubs that said, hey, you know what, I've got a whole garage full of stuff and I've got a lot of time to nurture you. And that was my experience. But I think that we're making assumptions that people even know how to Google. That's
an interesting point. You made a comment. I was going to say my source of information before I met Sid and his father in high school, Palos Verdes Public Library. And I'd go over there and check out the Radiometer's Handbook and read it. And I finally got my own copy. I've still got it, 1966 Radiometer's Handbook. I've got it. And I studied that, but it still wasn't enough. You needed that guidance. You need a person there to interact with and to guide you and to help you. And the Internet doesn't do that.
Right. Putting a PL259 connector on a piece of coax, I mean, I guess you could learn it from a YouTube video, but it's not the same as having some guy show you how he's been doing it for 50 years, so he can do it without slicing up his hand.
Funny you'd mentioned that. We called it the PL259 clinic in a radio club I used to belong to. We set aside some time before the meeting, and I brought in a bunch of tools and showed people, demonstrated, and then let them do it themselves, how to put a PL259 on coax the right way.
It's difficult, frankly. I mean, even for me, I've never been able to solder the braid through those holes.
Well, there's a trick to it.
So there you go.
The trick is having enough heat. And most people try and use a small pencil soldering iron. It'll never work. You got to have, I've got a 90 watt, well, actually I got two irons that I use. I got a 75 watt Weller iron with a huge, massive tip on it.
Right.
And an American Beauty 90 watt with a massive tip on it. And it makes it a breeze. It really makes it a breeze. That's the trick.
Just getting that little pencil in there into that hole and trying to melt that solder, boy,
it just doesn't work.
And burn my fingers on it as well. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Dennis, it's such a pleasure to have you. I know that the next time I'm in the Mojave Desert, I'm going to give you a call so I can come look at the Kidder Radio Museum.
Please do that. I would welcome that. You'd be an honored guest.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And with that, I want to wish you 73.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Dennis. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W6 Delta Queen in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to my new friend and audio editor, Ben Bresky, for putting this show together from the pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.